Another important model in the central nervous system is this here. It is called the ventricle model, and so it doesn't necessarily look like anything you've really seen before, perhaps, because this is showing you the negative space, so the holes, right, the cavities within the brain, as opposed to the positive space, the actual tissue itself. And so again, these are the ventricles. In order to understand them a little bit better, we can go over to this model right here. Okay, so this is looking at the right hemisphere of the brain, and what I want to point out is that this is the spinal cord. Okay, and so the spinal cord contains the central canal, so that's what this line is right here. As soon as the central canal enters into the brain, what we can see is that it gets wider. Okay, so it's continuous at the central canal, and it gets wider, forming this almost triangular shaped cavity between the pons and the cerebellum. This here is called the fourth ventricle. All right, now the fourth ventricle doesn't stay really big for long. It's going to narrow down, forming a little tube, a little canal through the midbrain. Okay, so this little canal is called the Cerebral Aqueduct. Now, when the Cerebral Aqueduct gets into the diencephalon, we can see that there's this little indentation. Right, this is part of the thalamus, so the positive space is the thalamus, the rest of the thalamus is over here. But in actuality, there is a little gap between the two halves of the thalamus, and actually that's what this little dot is showing you. It's showing you how both halves of the thalamus are going to communicate back and forth between them. Okay, so there's this gap, right, and that gap is called the third ventricle. Right, now, the third ventricle actually splits into the right and left lateral ventricles, and so again we are looking for negative space, right? An opening, not a solid piece of model, but an opening. And so what we can see over here is between the corpus callosum and the other half of the thalamus is a big opening, right? So you can see the pointer going into this opening. This negative space is the lateral, in fact the right lateral ventricle. Okay, so lateral ventricle, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle, and then of course that narrows down to form the central canal. All right, we can see when we look at this model here, the same structures. All right, so fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct. Here we have the third ventricle, and there is an opening here. If we open up the brain, we can see that the lateral ventricle actually has this funny shape. Right, so it kind of wraps around under the cerebrum here, and it's a little bit pointy in the back as it goes towards the occipital lobe. Okay, so when we go back to this model, what I want to show you is this here is a little triangular fourth ventricle. Okay, the fourth ventricle is going to narrow down to the cerebral aqueduct, so this would be in the midbrain. This is the negative space, or the third ventricle, right? We can even see that there's that little hole, so that's where the interthalamic adhesion would be, so that's where the thalami talk back and forth to each other. And then finally, we can see the lateral ventricles, right? This is the left lateral ventricle, this is the right lateral ventricle, and they even have these little points off to the back, right? Just like we saw in that other brain. This structure, right, so the point is the same point back there. Okay, a couple, or actually just one more structure that I want you to take note of on the ventricle model. Now most of it is gray, but as we can see there are a couple places that are actually pink. If you look closely, there's pink in the fourth ventricle, the third ventricle, and if you flip the model upside down, on both lateral ventricles as well. And so this is called the choroid plexus. This is actually where your cerebrospinal fluid is made.